Yo, what's good, Spirit Squad? It's your boy Dre, and today we're going to talk about Azorius spirits in the world of Pioneer. Last time we got to talk about this deck, we were looking at the Challenger deck, and for about $40 to $45 American, that's a pretty sweet buy. We got to go over it card by card, we got to play some matches with it, we even went 3-2 against tournament ready decks, so you know this is a great buy. And today what we're going to do is take an in-depth look at how to optimize this deck, make it fully tournament ready, and that way some of y'all can start nabbing some 5-0s with Azorius spirits as well. Also, the deck list will be right in the video description, so at any point if you need to just pause this and refer to that, you'll be able to. Let's check out some very specific changes and how we're going to make this a lot better. So when taking a look at this Pioneer Spirits deck, we're going to want to make 3 core changes in the deck from the way it's presented in the Pioneer box. The first thing we're going to do is address the lands, because in an aggressive deck, it is important to make sure you can play all of your cards on time. The mana base is honestly the biggest problem that the Challenger deck has. You have Temple of Enlightenment, you have a giant pile of basics, too many of your lands are not double color, or they come into play tapped. And when you're trying to play all of your cards on curve every game, that is a huge detriment, so we definitely want to address that first. The second thing we want to address is consistency. So the Challenger deck does come with less than 4 of the key creatures, and by key creatures I mean Mausoleum Wanderer and Spellqueller specifically. You do get only 3 of the Shacklegeist as well, and these are also going to be things that we get to address. That way we can actually see our good cards much more often than we normally would inside of just the base Challenger deck. And the last thing is going to be fine-tuning your deck for your actual environment. So if you're playing at like a local FNM and you know that 7 or 8 people around you are going to be playing the same decks all the time, then yeah, go ahead and adjust for that. You can play different suites of creatures, like for example playing Selfless Spirit in your main if you expect to see a lot of Supreme Verdicts, or you can start playing different things in your sideboard to address some certain needs. For example, if you're playing against a lot of spell-based decks, you can play Test of Talents. If you're playing against a lot of creatures, you can play things like Portable Hole and Devout Decree for those black and red decks. All of that fine-tuning is going to come with a lot of experience in just kind of figuring out what your deck's place in life wants to be. What we're going to do here is take a look at the exact deck list that I'm going to be playing, and we'll see exactly how I've addressed each of these 3 steps. So here's going to be a version of the deck list that you can go ahead and screenshot, for example, if you're on mobile, and that way you'll have access to it later. Now that we've gotten to do that, let's go ahead and check it out card by card so that we can kind of see what's what here. You'll notice on the left-hand side, we've got the mana base, and we are keeping the 22 land base that I think we saw in the Challenger list. So that is, I think, the ideal number of lands for this. And what we'll see here is that we've got a bunch of lands that produce 2 colors, and even some new ones. Here we've got a core of just a giant number of basic lands. We've got 4 Hengate Pathways. We've got 4 Hallowed Fountains and 4 Glacial Fortresses. These will ensure that we have near perfect mana with basically any 2 lands that you draw. And that'll make it so that you can play, multiple 1-drops on time. You can play Watch of the Spheres on turn 2, unless you draw exactly 2 islands and no other lands. And by the time turn 3 rolls around, you should be able to make your 3rd land drop and either play an Empyrean Eagle / Spellqueller, or play multiple spells in 1 turn. And either way, those things work out for you. We've also got 3 new lands here, and the 2 of here is going to be Deserted Beach. Now this is going to be one that comes in a tap unless it is your 3rd land drop or later. So if you play your first 2 lands, whatever, cool, you play this as your 3rd land or anytime after, a perfectly untapped dual land. So we don't want to see too many of these early because of the fact that they do come into play tapped on turns 1 and 2, but I think 2 is going to be a nice presentable number for Deserted Beach in Pioneer. And then we've got a spicy one up here, and it's going to be a Cave of the Frost Dragon. So this is going to be the one where if it is one of your first 2 lands, then it comes into play untapped. If it is your 3rd land drop or later, it will then come in tapped. But by that point in time, you already should, you already have 2 other lands in play, so you should be playing a decent amount of Magic with those. And a 3/4 flying creature land is pretty sweet. I don't think it's sweet enough to want more than one, especially since you don't want to risk drawing both of these if you play, say, 2, and then you have to mulligan your hand because you drew like white land in your base blue deck. But I do think that 1 is going to be pretty good here, because on turn 1, for example, you can draw one of your 106 basic islands. Turn 2, you can play this Cave of the Frost Dragon, and that'll still let you play something like a Watcher of the Spheres. So I still think that that's going to be a pretty decent one of. If you want to play something like Hall of the Storm Giants instead, because it taps for blue, that is a perfectly acceptable decision you're allowed to make. Just know that even as a 7/7, a ground creature is a lot easier to deal with than any flyer, even if it's 4 full power greater than, the Cave of the Frost Dragon here. So now that we've addressed the mana base, let's talk about consistency. Here we've only had a few spots to show up, which is actually pretty good, but we wanted to make sure we're definitely playing all 4 copies of Mausoleum Wanderer. Mausoleum Wanderer is honestly probably the best card in this entire deck. It's really absurd for the rate that you get it at. You can counter things like Treasure Cruises, Sylvan Awakenings, Supreme Verdict-like effects that are, not actually named Supreme Verdict, so you get to kill like Shadow's Verdicts, Languishes, Settle the Wreckages, all of those other sweepers. Mausoleum Wanderer handles just fine. It also counters Bring to Light, which is a really big deal in this format. So we definitely want to make sure we're playing a full 40s, especially since they are great at attacking. We're going to take this down to 3 Spectral Sailors so that we do have a full 7 1-drops that we're playing, which is actually 1 more than the 6 1-drops that the Challenger deck gave us, because the Challenger deck gave us 4 Spectral Sailors but only 2 Wanderers. Here, we've both made our 1-drops better, and we're playing an additional 1, so we're even more aggressive. We're also playing 3 copies of Spell Pierce in the main, because we do want to make sure we're able to take care of all of our opponent's non-creature spells. So we'll find a lot of people playing things like Thought Seizes, Burn Spells, Jeskai Ascendancies, Bring to Lights, all kinds of things that Spell Pierce really just wants to make sure your opponent can't get away with. We also are putting in a 4th copy of Shacklegeist. So this is going to be one of those cards that lets us really control combat, and that's going to be very relevant against a few specific archetypes. It's going to be relevant against things like black-white auras. It's going to be relevant against things like even burn. You just don't really want to be taking damage from creatures if you don't have to. There's a lot of big green creatures in the format, like green-red is one of the best decks, so we want to make sure that we have cards like Shacklegeist to help control combat and just kind of tell your opponent no a little more often. We're also putting in additional 2 copies of Spell Queller. So this one's going to be pretty sweet too, where, you just get to make sure that your spell-based opponents have a terrible time dealing with you. And honestly, a 2/3 flyer is pretty good against a lot of the creature-based decks too. So a lot of the creatures that attack in this format, unless they're like black-white auras and they're just making something a huge, most of the things in this format are usually like 2/2s. So Spell Queller actually has a better than average time attacking and blocking in this format. And that's going to be a lot better than, say, Modern, where, Spell Queller is going to need the help of a Lord to attack or block through pretty much anything in that format. But here, a 2/3 flyer is actually pretty baller. And the sideboard is where we've got a lot of decent fun stuff going on. And we wanted to shift around the numbers so that we've got some nice 4-ups for consistency's sake too. So here, the first thing we wanted to do was play all 4 copies of Portable Hole. The Challenger deck gave us things like Silk Wrap and Baffling End and other things that are certainly not bad at 2 mana, but 2 mana is less than 1 mana, and that matters a lot. I'm sorry, 2 mana is more than 1 mana, rather, and that matters a lot. So we want Portable Hole here because that helps take care of things like Young Pyromancers, Dreadhorde Arcanist, Thing in the Ice, all kinds of threats that can and will see a lot of play in this format. It also deals with a lot of opposing spirits, which is, not exactly what we want to hear, but, if your opponent's the one with the spirit in play, you want to be able to get rid of it. We're playing 3 copies of Selfless Spirit because blue-white control-based decks are a big part of the format, And we really want to make sure that we're not just auto-dying to something like a Supreme Verdict. So between Selfless Spirit and Spell Queller, Supreme Verdict decks should have a pretty bad time dealing with us in general. It's also really good for just a lot of combat-based matches, because when you get into a big combat war with a Selfless Spirit, you can give your entire team indestructible, and of course your team is still going to do with its blocking or attacking damage, so your opponent's going to have a really bad time in combat when only you have access to indestructible. It's already bad enough for them since we have flying, but you know how that goes. We've got 3 copies of Mystical Dispute here, and I think this is going to be one of the best counter spells in the entire format. A large part of the top end of the format is blue, and being able to deal with all of that for just 1 mana is going to be pretty sweet. We've got 2 copies of Nebelgast Herald. These provide the same function as Shacklegeist, except, you know, we get to play 6 of these effects here instead of just 4. So having an instant speed way to make sure that your opponents have a really bad time in combat is a huge boon against all of these creature-based decks. So again, Black-White Auras being the biggest example, but also things like green decks, again, things like Burn. Anything that really wants to just be attacking you for lethal is going to have a really bad time of it when you have access to Shacklegeist and Nebelgast Herald and they don't. And then the last 3 spots are going to go to Dennick, Pious Apprentice, and this is a new one. So the front half of this card is going to be for a blue and a white. It's a 2/3 lifelinker, and cards in graveyards can't be the target to spells or abilities. So a 2/3 lifelinker for 2 is honestly already kind of good enough to see play against Burn. Burn is one of the best decks in the format, and it's one of our worst matchups. So what we want to do against that deck is say something like putting in Portable Hole so that we can get rid of their early creatures, and Dennick so that we can make sure that we have a 2/3 lifelinker. And the combination of those two should help us a lot against that matchup, because most of their burn spells either cost 2 or deal 2, and that's not really a great rate either way against Dennick. So being a 2/3 lifelinker for only 2 is pretty big game, especially if we get to do something like, say, protect it with a Spell Pierce. And then the back half is a lot less relevant than the front half, but it's still good enough to warrant consideration. And it's just a 3/2 flyer for 4, and whenever one or more creature cards are put into graveyards from anywhere, you get to investigate. But it only happens once a turn, so if your opponent plays, say, a Supreme Verdict and 4 of your creatures die, you're still only gonna get to investigate once. Whatever, still good enough. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the other part of the front half of Dennick is actually relevant. So the cards in graveyards can't be the target to spells or abilities. So one of the best decks in this format is going to be Red-Black Dreadhorde Arcanist, and Dreadhorde Arcanist itself does target cards in graveyards. And if you catch your opponent playing a Demilic version of, is it Phoenix? Demilic itself also targets cards in graveyards. So if we do need to make sure we're able to kind of shut those decks down, Dennick provides another way to do that on top of just a lifelinker being good enough most of the time. So these are going to be things to look out for when trying to sideboard this card in. But this is going to be what I think is the optimized version of this deck for what the format looks like now. And speaking of what the format looks like now, we'll actually switch right over to checking out the Pioneer meta. And yeah, we'll go over that together. So here we've got the Pioneer meta as a whole. This is going to be what the top decks look like. And here we'll see that Is It Phoenix is all the way on top of the meta. And it's going to have a lot of cheap spells like Lightning Axes, Magma Sprays, Treasure Cruises to refill their hand after they exhaust all of their stuff. And then they're looking to revive Arclight Phoenixes out of the graveyard. So this matchup can go either way most of the time. We have a hard time against them because they basically never run out of cards. It also doesn't hurt them to have a lot of cheap removal when they, say, draw like 3 Magma Sprays, for example. That feels pretty good against a deck full of 2/2s. The downside to what they're doing is that their main plan is usually reviving Arclight Phoenixes out of the graveyard. And of course, Phoenixes themselves are 3/2 flyers. They are so used to that just being an unchecked attacker that a lot of the time we don't care because, we're the flying deck. So we're going to usually have even more flying power on the battlefield than the deck that revives flyers for free. So we can overwhelm them pretty easily, especially since Arclight Phoenix isn't that helpful in combat. The way they usually beat us is actually by using Thing in the Ice. So just make sure you're on the lookout for that. The next best deck is going to be Burn, and Burn is tough. They have a lot of really cheap threats. They have a lot of cheap answers in their Burn spells, and their answers happen to kill most of our creatures too. So this is definitely one of the tougher matchups, and that's why we are, highlighting things like the Portable Holes and like the Denix so that we can help deal with this. Naya Winota is going to be a deck that literally is just trying to combo with Winota herself. So when you attack with a non-creature and you have a Winota on the table, a non-human creature, you look at the top 6 cards of your deck and you put any humans from those tapped and attacking for each instance of that trigger. So that's their goal. They're going to try to put out a bunch of non-human creatures, put a Winota on the table, transmute to a bunch of human creatures also attacking, and then get us dead by a lot. We have both Lofty Denial and Spell Queller to help deal with Winota herself. I'm going to keep calling her Naya. One of my friend's kids' name is Naya, and I just talked with her like an hour ago, so that's going to keep being a thing when I reference this deck. Anyway, I think Winota herself is very easy to handle for this deck, and the rest of their deck is honestly not very good in combat against us. Because most of what they're looking to do is going to be like Llanowar Elves, Prosperous Innkeeper, sometimes like Asika's Chariot, and all of those cards are sometimes good enough against things like the control decks that can only kill like one creature at a time, but they usually lose to us in combat by a lot if they have to play fairly. Next up is going to be Blue-White Control, and that's going to be a format-defining deck again, just like it is in Modern. And we have a lot of ways to get around that too. Like we have Lofty Denials, we have Spell Pierces, we have Spell Quellers. We also have Selfless Spirit out of the sideboard to deal with specifically Supreme Verdict, and even Mystical Dispute that can counter things like Teferi's, the 5-drop. The 3-drop is not legal in Pioneer. To deal with Teferi 5 and to deal with Narset, and if they're playing Search for Escanta, Mystical Dispute can deal with that. So we have a lot of really good ways to make sure that they're just not going to body us for free. If you're ultra scared of your opponent's Shark Typhoons, we can even sideboard in the 2 copies of Nebelgeist Herald so that we can help deal with that too. We've got lots of ways to deal with what they're doing. Next up is going to be Dimir Control. And Dimir is going to be a lot of the same as Blue-White, except their removal is better at the expense of them not being able to play Supreme Verdict. That's your matchup. We grouped the 2 decks that are similar together, so now we can kind of skip back and go to Rakdos Pyromancer. And that's going to be one that wants to use cards like Dreadhorde Arcanist and Young Pyromancer to generate value when they play their spells like Thoughtseizes, Fatal Pushes, Duresses, things like that. And then recoup that value from the graveyard with Dreadhorde Arcanist or Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. We get to do a couple of things to that plan. First and foremost, we can protect our creatures from their removal spells. So if they're trying to like Fatal Push, Magma Spray, Kolaghan's Command us out of the water, we get to have things like Spell Pierces, Rattle Chains, to make sure that we're able to dodge all of that removal. And a cool thing about specifically playing against the red removal they play, a lot of our creatures will grow themselves too. So if your opponent, for example, points a Magma Spray or a Kolaghan's Command at one of your creatures that has the ability to, give itself extra power and toughness, or if you have a Rattle Chains in play, a play that we'll have access to is, for example, putting a Spirit into play at instant speed, and that will grow our Mausoleum Wanderers, that will grow our Watcher of the Spheres. And if you have a Rattle Chains in play, you can sometimes flash in a Supreme Verdict or an Empyrean Eagle to make it so that the damage their Magma Sprays and friends are dealing to our creatures is not lethal. So sometimes we will have the opportunity to kind of fizzle a spell, if you will. And that's going to be really big game. Out of the sideboard, we've got Portable Hole and Denick, and both of those are going to be really good for us. Portable Hole stops all of your Young Peasy and or Dreadhorde Arcanist shenanigans. It also exiles a Resolved Croxa, so that's pretty big. We also get to have access to Denick, and Denick makes it so that Dreadhorde Arcanist can't target things in graveyards. So if you resolve a Denick and maybe can protect it, then their day gets bad really quickly. If you're really scared of Croxa, the Nebelgast Herald can also make sure it just never attacks. Next up is going to be red-green aggro, and that's about as simple as it gets, really. They're just trying to play a bunch of creatures and smash your face in. They do have Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystics, so they can do it pretty quickly. They also get to play things like Burning Tree Emissary, so they're really ridiculous hands, especially on the play. Can be ultra fast, but honestly, we don't care most of the time. As long as we're able to make it past like turn 4, we're pretty good against them. So things like Nebelgast Herald are really good on top of the Shackle guys to help control their combat, especially since they are an Embercleave deck. If they're, trying to double strike and trample us and stuff like that, then we can just make sure they never get to attack. Denick is also just like decent as a lifelinker, so that's not nothing. And a lot of the creatures are CMCs 3 and 4 and stuff, so we need to make sure that Portable Hole is not like our only out to them, but it still is pretty good against things like Llanowar Elves and Elvish Mystics. One big downside to playing against this deck that we need to be aware of is that they do play copies of Shifting Ceratops out of the board, and if you see a lot of the red-green decks in your area, then my honest advice is probably going to be to not play Nebelgast Herald in your sideboard, and instead play something like Settle the Wreckage or Fateful Absence so that you can deal with Shifting Ceratops, because it will come up. Next up is actually going to be Spirits. So as you can see, we are one of the best decks in the meta, which is another reason I'm so hyped about this Challenger deck existing, because, you get to instantly buy part of your way into one of the best decks in the whole meta. So against the Mirror, we've got these sweet Mystical Disputes, and Mystical Dispute counters basically the entire main deck, which is already really sweet. But you get Portable Hole, which helps take care of most of the deck, provided of course that you don't give your opponent a chance to respond with like Spell Queller or Rattle Chains or something like that, but it is a serviceable removal spell since it only costs 1. Nebelgast Herald also is really good sometimes. Like, you can flash in a Spectral Sailor, tap down their big attack or a blocker, while you're in the middle of trying to amass, more Lord effects in play than your opponent, or more Shacklegeists than your opponent, things like that. Nebelgast Herald does a really great job at providing additional tap effects so that you can get your damage in more often than your opponent. But other than that, good luck in the Mirror. It's pretty hard, but pretty fun. Next up is going to be Niv to Light. And Niv to Light is one of those decks that does a little bit of everything, but lucky for us, most of those things naturally fail against the things that we're doing. So they're trying to play just like big, dumb, really powerful spells that are cheap at the expense of being multicolored. And we're pretty good against those things. So we have the Spell Pierces and Lofty Denials to help against the things like Bring to Light, Binding the Old Gods, and all the other really powerful spells that they're just trying to cast a little early. We also have, the Rattle Chains to help deal with a lot of their spot removal, because they play things like Dreadbores, Abrupt Decays, again, Binding the Old Gods, Vanishing Verse, just a ton of targeted removal. And Rattle Chains is one of the best cards in the deck because it makes it so that we don't have to care about their targeted removal basically at all. And against the bigger half of their deck, the Lofty Denial is just super nice because they're casting Niv Mizzets. They're casting things like Tolsimir that will bring in a wolf and fight one of your creatures and gain life. We want to deal with none of those things, so Lofty Denial is really going to against all of that. And then Spell Queller stops a lot of the developmental spells too. So if you can Spell Quell something like a Binding the Old Gods that, their goal is to both kill something and ramp them up in mana, that's a great play for us. And out of the sideboard here, we get to have things like Mystical Dispute, and that's one of the best cards against this deck because all of their top end cards are at least part blue. So like Yorion is blue, Niv Mizzet is blue, Bring to Light is blue. So countering their like 4 and 5 mana huge plays for just 1 mana on our end is super sweet, and we definitely want to take advantage of that against them. Let me hide me real quick. And the last deck that's over here at the top is going to be Scissors. And this is going to be a deck that plays a bunch of artifacts like Stonecoil Serpent, Ornithopter, things like that. And then you get to play an Ensoul artifact to just like make their thing a 5/5 and try to kill us that way. Luckily, that is a strategy we're pretty good against. Even though they have things like Scissors and all that glitters and stuff to make their creatures huge and or flying, we're one of the few decks that just like really does not give a fuck about that plan. So even when they resolve the cool part of their plan, we still have things like Shacklegeist to make sure that their big giant attackers and or blockers don't get to do their job either way. We also have things like Spell Pierce, so if they try to kind of fire off the gates with a really quick Scissors or something, we do have enough counter spells in the main and on the cheap to deal with all of that. And then, you know, we get to untap and maybe have one of those Watcher of the Spheres turns where we get to just kind of unload on our opponent. And in the sideboard against this deck, we've got things like Portable Holes and Nebelgast Heralds, which just provide additional help against this deck. I think against Scissors, I would not side in Mystical Disputes. Even though Scissors itself is blue, I think that's overkill. Enough of their spells are white, not blue, that I don't know that I would want to side in a counterspell that's usually going to cost 3 against them. But Portable Hold is really good against all of their creatures, especially creatures that they've already put a copy of Scissors on or a copy of All That Glitters on. You can just, you know, Portable Hold a creature, the enchantment falls off, their day is pretty bad, etc., etc. And Nebelgast Herald makes it so that even when they do their thing, you can still just flash in any spirit, and they just never get to attack with their 5/5s, or larger. So, as you can see, we've got at least decent plans against all 10 of the best decks in the format, and that's going to be a lot of why I think this deck is so good right now. So we'll just go ahead and kind of ship this, go back to our main deck once again, kind of go over this, and we'll bring me back. But that's really going to be our video today. We've gotten to see exactly what our plan is to optimize blue-white spirits. We see that we, you know, had a real plan for every card in this deck, especially when presented against any of the top 10 decks in the format. So if you think maybe, I don't know, I'm a little too optimistic when presenting this list, then let me know what you think about it, what you're playing in spirits, and how you would change it. If you think that, you know, maybe this is not really the best value, then I think I'm actually going to point back to the deck list itself, because that's one thing I also wanted to talk about and kind of forgot earlier. So when looking at the deck list itself, we'll notice that up top here on tabletop, it's only $165 total, and that's including all of the updated mana base, that's including all of the 4-ofs for your creatures, and as we noticed, as far as the creature base is concerned, buying the Challenger deck provided us with most of these creatures already. We just kind of had to fill in some gaps. So you actually don't even have to do that much work to give yourself the best version of this. If you're playing on Magic Online, the entire deck is less than 37 ticks to own. And this is with a fully optimized mana base, including Shocklands, Pathways. You even have a Cave of the Frost Dragon, which if you don't want to play that, then save yourself the $2.50. Like, this deck is ridiculously light on the wallet for something I would be fully confident in bringing to something like a Grand Prix or a Star City Open. Like, I would play this list tomorrow. So I'm really excited about this. So that means the next video that we have, instead of just being a primer like today, is going to contain some gameplay. So that should be pretty sweet. And I'm going to go ahead and play through at least a league or two with this, if not a preliminary event as well. So let me know what changes you might make to this, or what you're doing with your Spirits list. Or if you're just coming to Spirits and look forward to watching that, let me know that as well. But as always, if you like what you're watching, just make sure to like the video, sub the channel if you haven't done so already, and I'll see y'all on the next one.